me faculty thinking about HSI distinctly around like faculty, right? Around faculty life. So that's top of my mind, is learning from all this stuff that I've been sharing how to do HSI and servingness for so long, and now I get to do it finally. I didn't get to do it for so long. Besides campuses I worked with, I obviously do a lot of consulting with campuses and help them to drive it, but now it matters because it's my campus, right? And we're gonna see this come. We will see we will hit 25%. I'm for sure. I'm gonna see that. Will I see the moment where we are fully HSI, fully embracing servingness? Probably not, right? Like I said, this is gonna take time and embrace that. But so that's pretty cool, is that I get to finally do the work that I talk so much about.
Hello, and welcome to Student Affairs Now. I'm your host, Keith Edwards. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Gina Garcia, who has researched, written about, speaks and consults, and even has a podcast on Hispanic Serving Institutions, HSIs. Gina is a fierce advocate for these institutions, especially the students they serve, could, and will serve. I'm so excited to learn from you today. Student Affairs Now is the premier podcast and online learning community for thousands of us who work in, alongside, or adjacent to the field of higher education and student affairs. We release new episodes every week on Wednesdays. Find details about this episode or browse our archives at studentaffairsnow.com. This episode is sponsored by Rutledge, Taylor & Francis. View their complete catalog of education titles at rutledge.com/education. This episode is also sponsored by Huron, a global professional services firm that collaborates with clients to put possible into practice. As I mentioned, I'm your host, Keith Edwards. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a speaker, author, and coach, helping higher ed leaders and organizations advance leadership, learning, and equity. You can find out more about me at keithedwards.com. And I'm recording this from my home in Minneapolis, Minnesota, at the intersections of the ancestral homelands of both the Dakota and the Ojibwe peoples. Let's get to the conversation. Gina, thank you so much for joining us. Let's just give you some space to introduce yourself and your work with HSIs for folks who aren't as familiar.
Okay, hello everybody, and thank you, Keith, for the invitation to be here on Student Affairs Now. It brings me joy whenever I can get back to my student affairs roots. As you know, I have extensive training in student affairs, have a degree in college student personnel from the University of Maryland, and did spend a lot of time, my early formative years, in various student affairs roles. I don't spend as much time now because I am in a faculty role and do a lot of research. But I always keep it close to my heart, right? That student affairs is really, I always say that's my entryway into higher education, despite the fact that I now do much sort of broader, right, sort of research, higher ed broadly. So yeah, I'm Gina Garcia. I'm a professor at UC Berkeley. I'm a full professor, one of less than 2% Latina identified full professors in the country. So definitely have to say that. It's mind-blowing to me to even say that, but I do, I do respect that, and also it's an honor, right, to be able to carry that and to know that there's a lot of folks that are going to follow me, and that part of my role is really opening the doors and making sure there are going to be more Latina identified full professors to follow. So my pronouns are she and her, for Spanish speakers, ella, and I write about Hispanic Serving Institutions. I pretty much do, that's my whole life, if you really think about it. Many scholars have multiple strands of research. Even when I would write my research statement early on, when I was a little baby scholar, as I say, I always had 3 strands. And at this point, I don't have 3 strands. HSI is my strand. There are different dimensions of how I write about HSIs, different dimensions of how I think about Hispanic Serving Institutions, but overall, that's where I spend most of my time. I think part of it is because when I really started doing HSI research in 2012, 2013, like when I was doing my dissertation, there was not a lot of extensive research about HSIs. At that point, there was some descriptive stuff. Excellencia in Education had wrote a series of briefs. They were doing a lot of, policy briefs to help us to understand HSIs in general, but there wasn't like deep empirical meaning making about HSIs. And so there was so much to do, and there still is so much to do when it comes to thinking about HSIs and how we're going to think about servingness and advancing this idea of servingness. So I spend most of my time thinking about HSIs. I have a research team at UC Berkeley. My research team is 8 students that all wanted to study higher education when I got there. I've been at UC Berkeley since fall 2023, so newer to UC Berkeley, and we just think about HSIs and do research with HSIs. We have a couple different projects, participatory action research type projects. That's where a lot of my research is now, is collecting data to make meaning, to create new knowledge around HSIs. But really, I'm in an action-based part of my career where I'm like, we're gonna do servingness. We're gonna transform institutions. And if I can get grants to help campuses do that while also studying it, then that's what I want to do, because I want to see the actual change that I write about. So that's what I spend most of my time doing. Besides, yes, I have a podcast, Get Boss HSIs, check it out. And I spend a lot of time doing a lot of public speaking. Again, being one of, I guess, leading voices of HSIs, and one of the first real scholar voices of HSIs. There's a lot of great scholarship now, a lot of good scholars doing work, but I'm definitely have come into the scene as one of the leading voices of HSIs. So do a lot of public speaking as well.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I love that intro, and we've known each other. I was trying to do the math. It's almost 20 years. I'm not going to say it's 20 years, but it's almost, when you were that baby scholar at the University of Maryland, and I was there too. So, I used the word fierce in the introduction, and it's no surprise that you're focused on participatory research and action and the doing. And you've always been someone who wants to not just theorize and talk about it, but put it into practice and serve people and make the world a better place. And so, love seeing you do that. In all of the different ways that you're doing that. Let's just get grounded here for maybe folks who this is a little bit new, who may not be as familiar, and maybe dispel some myths and misconceptions that you maybe encounter in some of the work that you're doing and some of the speaking engagements. But when we talk about Hispanic Serving Institutions, HSIs, what is that? What does that encompass? What does that really mean? And then we'll dive in deeper, as you mentioned, into serving this here in a little bit.
Yeah. So Hispanic Serving Institutions are colleges and universities that enroll 25% Hispanic students. It is a federal designation, been around since 1992. 1992 to 1995 is the sort of time frame that it becomes official, and then that they eventually get funded, right? That there is now a funding stream with monies that are earmarked for Hispanic Serving Institutions. But HSI really is not anything else beyond that definition. So from the federal government's perspective, from the Department of Education, who is the one that they actually say they don't designate, they actually they determine whether or not an institution is eligible. So they call it HSI eligible, and HSI eligible means HSI eligible to apply for competitive grants. So the 25% really makes you eligible to apply for competitive grants. And that's the federal government's role. And, because I study higher education from this large perspective, I understand the federal government's role in higher ed, and providing funding is one of them without providing the regulation or the things that we have to do to make HSI. So that's not what the federal government, that's not what they're in, that's not their job, right? But to supply the funding, you can submit the competitive grant, and you can decide whatever you want to do with that competitive money, which I think is probably a very unique part of the HSI grants, and also a really good part. There's pros and cons to it. Everybody's doing something different. They're doing whatever the heck they want. And some of that's good, to have a lot of innovation and be able to implement new things that your campus needs with your federal funding is great. But also there's not regulations to what that looks like. So for example, you could submit a grant that's only going to serve 10 people. You're going to launch a new type of curriculum that's only going to serve 10 or 20 people. And that's fine. If it goes through the competitive process and it gets funded, then that's what HSI is for your campus. And so there's no consistency right across campuses of what they're doing with the funding. And therefore this idea of servingness comes into play, because we're like, well, what does it mean beyond the federal designation? What more than enrolling 25%? Because across the board, most people agreed that enrolling 25% Latinx students was insufficient to be Hispanic serving, right? That word serving for people was that can't be it. Enrollment cannot be it, particularly when you're bringing in a group of students who are historically underserved by educational systems in many, many ways, historically underserved by this country in many, many ways, and say that now you're serving them just because you provided them a slot, right? Like they admitted, you admitted them, right? That's not serving if you're not actually doing anything to make sure that they like ensure their success at the end of the day. So the grants really are intended for that. You are supposed to use the grants to ensure their success, ensure educational outcomes and attainment are greater than before you got the grant. That's the goal, right? Is that you do things that is going to be greater, lead to greater outcomes. But again, like I said, it's so like just undefined that people can do whatever they want. So there's not a lot of consistency with what HSIs do with the federal dollars. I guess one myth I would say is that I dispel a lot is that people feel that HSI is Hispanic exclusive. And that doesn't feel good to anybody, particularly when we're in a world of like, you know, we want to be diverse, we want to be inclusive. So all of a sudden it feels exclusive, right? To say we're Hispanic serving is like, but what about all the rest of our students? And so I spent a lot of time breaking down how it doesn't mean exclusion. Federal government definitely doesn't mean intended to be exclusionary. Your federal grants actually are intended to serve your campus. They're capacity building grants, so the campus is supposed to be better. The argument, of course, is that you should, if you make it better for a minoritized population, like your Latina students, it's going to be good for other students as well. It's just a matter of focusing on that population to think, what do they specifically need, right? What do your Latina students specifically need? But the exclusionary part feels weird for people. They want to know what about students. The biggest group of students I get asked about is what about Black students? That's huge, right? Like people are like very concerned that like a really minoritized population, and I'll just say minority because often an HSI campus is one of the smallest populations, not all HSIs, but one of your smallest populations being Black students, yet we know from an equity perspective, they're struggling the most often, right? That there are the greatest barriers to equity and least equitable outcomes for our Black populations, also our Indigenous populations. So despite them being smallest groups on HSI campuses, how do we ensure we're still doing that work, right? How do we ensure we're still doing equity work? So I do talk about HSI as a racial equity project for that reason. Like HSI is not exclusionary, it's a racial equity project. So if you're doing equity work and you're disaggregating your data, then you're going to continue to focus on the groups that really need you. And hands down, it's always going to be your Black students. It's always going to be your Indigenous students, your Native students. It's often going to be your Latinx students. I say often because there are campuses that are almost hitting equity. And then they start to feel like, oh no, now what do we do? And I'm like, you celebrate, right? Like you celebrate equity.
Tell the world what you did.
Yes, what did you do?
Yeah.
Exactly. But it's weird. People get like, oh no, there's no more, we're getting close to equity. I'm like, that's great. Let's do it, right? So there is a lot of that. That's probably one of the biggest myths. There's a ton of myths in HSI, but the feeling that it's exclusionary is, I think, the hardest for people to get past.
Yeah. So moving from this demographic designation to the servingness is a big part of it. 25%, that's still 75% other students, right? There's still a lot of room there. And some HSIs have a lot more than that. Some are right at that mark, but a lot of other students. And I love your point about if you're using these federal grant dollars in ways that improves the campus community for those Latina, Latinx, Hispanic students, that will also be better for other students, particularly students who are struggling. And if the campus becomes better for students who are struggling, it's also better for students who experience a lot of privilege and access, right? It's going to be better for everyone. So I love that. Any other myths or misconceptions we want to dispel as we get off the gate here?
I said there were tons, huh? There's so many.
Yeah.
Oh man. I think that's the biggest one is the exclusionary piece. I think the usage of dollars gets misconstrued for students, right? So from when you start bringing students into the HSI conversation, which you should, if you're listening right now and you're trying to figure out how to do HSI on your campus, please get students involved. Like students are not always brought into the HSI conversation, and it's like we're trying to serve students, but we don't ask students. Like, Go figure, right? And so one of the things is then students want to know, so we're getting $2.5 million. Where's the $2.5 million? Where's my piece of it, right? Where do since I checked the Hispanic box, clearly I'm part of the reason why you have an HSI designation. Where's the money, right? Where do I get to, tap into some of those dollars? So having to dispel some of that, because like I said, they are capacity building grants. The campus gets to use them to create a better campus, right? In whatever ways we believe, right, that the campus is going to be better. So even having to work through that with students, so to help them to understand what kind of grants these are, or particularly when they're thinking about like grants or fellowships that come to them for individual, for their individual need, this isn't that kind of grant. Right, so it is a different kind of source of funding from the federal government that isn't like your financial aid dollars, right? So that's something to dispel with students, right? Like, so I think with each individual group, it's really thinking through like, what is your misconceptions, right? What are you thinking about HSI that is maybe inaccurate? So I think that's an important one, particularly if people are thinking about how to engage students in this HSI conversation.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm sort of thinking that the number of campuses that are going to become HSIs has to be like this hockey stick going up right now in terms of certainly certain parts of the country, but also in many parts of the country where that population is just booming. And like you said, there's a lot of equity gaps, access gaps in pre-college, in K-12 and other things. Also intersections of racism and classism and ethnocentrism and immigration. But this seems to be like that. I would think the number of HSIs is just ballooning right now and will continue to do so.
Yes. So at the time of recording in July 2024, I'll say that we are at 600 or so, right?
Wow.
Yes, we're 600 HSIs now, currently at the campuses that have met the 25%, right, mark. There are nearly 400 emerging HSIs. So the emerging HSI is like 15 to 24%. So yeah, they're going to keep going up. It's obviously correlated with the number of Latina students entering colleges and universities, which has dramatically increased in the last 2 decades, right? Like completely increased, and will continue to increase because this is one of our largest growing populations in the country. So when you have a largest growing population, also a young population. So a young population is the schools, right? All we have to do is look at schools, school districts that are already hitting those predominantly Latina points. Obviously, those kids have to go somewhere, right? So where are they going? And we know that the patterns are generally that they are likely to stay close to home, right? So we will see our open access, broad access, community college type of campuses that will see this designation quicker, right? So we're not seeing it as quick as like at the most selective institutions in the country, because that's not where our Latina population is generally going, right? There are obviously there are students that are entering that, but a big part of the population is staying close to home, is going to open access, is going to community colleges. We know, community colleges have large percentages of Latina students are entering at the community college. So it's different types of institutions, right? That's what HSI. So HSI is wrapped up in broad access sort of institutions that are close to where the population is, all right? Which right now is 30 states and locations. So locations including Puerto Rico, right? So we're got 20 more states that haven't hit that, but a lot of those states have the emerging HSIs, and we'll have them eventually.
Yeah. Well, I'm having conversations in my work with institutions that are real close. And so they're trying to figure out what's that going to mean, and how would we shift things, and how would we adjust, and how do we serve this population? But it seems like kind of a binary designation. Like when you have 23% Latina students, you should still be thinking about them. You shouldn't wait till you get to 25.1% and then start thinking about servingness, right? The emerging, what are we building? What are we doing? Even though maybe we don't have the grants, right? It's a huge chunk of the student population.
Oh, yeah. No, actually, so I'm writing a new book. I'm working on a book right now. So, and the chapter I'm working on right now is about emerging HSIs and how they're actually doing some of the most dramatic work and most innovative work. So yeah, I'm excited about that chapter. I'm excited about the book in general because I'm talking about processes of change or processes of towards servingness. And so yeah, those institutions are doing more than campuses that have been HSIs for 30 years. I'm working with the campus that I won't name them, but they know who they are if they listen, that I started working with them and they thought they were a new HSI. And then as we dug in, they had been an HSI basically since the beginning of HSI. It's like they had been an HSI for so long already, and they just had never talked about it or thought about it, right? It was just sort of, the water you swim in kind of thing, right? This is just the population without thinking much about any sort of intentionality around serving. So the emergers actually, I think, are doing some of the most innovative kind of work. And if you want to learn from anybody, look at the emergers. The emerging HSIs are doing some really cool type of work and getting ready. Because 25% is a lot, particularly at a large campus. So we're not talking small numbers, like this, it's a lot by the time you get to 25%. And then the other thing is, I know you mentioned 75% of other, students. The data are pretty much showing that at this point, we're about a good majority of HSIs are at about 25% white and 75% students of color. And so that's what the numbers are looking like, that yes, 25%, but some are upwards of 50% Latina, and still you have another 25% other students of color, right, who are checking student of color boxes. So some of the most, I think, diverse institutions in the country, in my opinion.
Right. No, that totally makes sense. And robust. I'm also thinking about the locations of some of these and the communities that they're in, and they're a part of. These are not just diverse institutions; they're in diverse places and diverse contexts, and not just racially and ethnically diverse, but SES diverse and all of those things. And also, I'm imagining, you talk about open access institutions that are more rooted in the community, more connected to the communities that they're a part of, than you maybe find at some more highly selective institutions that are a little separated from that. You've pointed to this thing a time or two, but let's talk about servingness, which I know gets you really excited. And the new book is on that, and you talk about a lot on the podcast. So you mentioned it earlier, moving from a demographic designation to a servingness and student success focus. But tell us what servingness is and what this means and how institutions can put this into practice.
Yeah, for sure. Yes, servingness. The servingness term, most people would point to officially getting coined in 2019 with an article that me and my colleagues wrote in 2019. Well, we wrote it obviously before 2019, but it got published in 2019. So that's when the term really, I guess, sort of got solidified in the HSI vernacular. At the time, I don't know that we realized that servingness was going to take off as such a big thing. We were just proposing this framework to think about it. But servingness to me was I say often an embodiment, right, of serving, that it's actual bringing something to life, right, where you are so focused on the S in HSI that you bring it to life, right, and it becomes what you do. It becomes at your core. It's your values. It's your deep way of making sense of how you're going to do higher ed, right? For colleges and universities. So I think about embodiment, right? That's how I think about servingness, the embodiment of serving others. From the podcast, anybody that listens will know that people often talk about servingness, that their servingness journey started when they're with their grandma, right? With their abuelitas, with their communities, right? With their mother, with their tias, with that, it's sort of ingrained in us, right? If you are really committed to doing servingness, that it's part of our community, it's part of our culture, right, to sort of serve. So people have embraced servingness in so many different ways, but the theoretical way of defining it, I would say servingness is everything beyond enrollment, right? Like I said, enrollment was that point where people are it cannot be enrollment only. HSIs cannot be based on enrollment only. So it's everything beyond enrollment. So yeah, great, congratulations, you hit 25%. Now everything else is servingness, right? Anything else you're doing. And so for those campuses that are getting ready before the 25%, they're doing servingness before the 25%. You can do servingness without having 25%. You can do servingness without having HSI grants because they are competitive and a lot of campuses don't get them. It doesn't mean you're not an HSI, and it doesn't mean you can't do servingness. It actually, you can. So you don't need a grant and you don't need the official designation to do servingness. I guess the big important piece of servingness is the structural transformation. So I talk about everything we do at the campus level, the structural transformation is servingness. So I talk about infrastructure, and in my newer book, Transforming HSIs, there's a whole chapter on infrastructure, and I always say infrastructure is like the tangible things that we do. And what the research shows is that students make sense of servingness by the tangible things. So if you ask students what servingness is to them, they're going to tell you those tangible things. One of them is faculty diversity. That comes up over and over again. Students want the faculty to look like them. The data show us that they don't, that about 60 to 70% of most HSIs have predominantly white faculty, right? 60 to 70% of the faculty are white. And that's across the board. And those data have been cut in many different ways, 2-year, 4-year, public, private, and across the board, it continues to look like that. I think one of the most cited articles for those that want to look into it more is my colleague actually here at UC Berkeley, Nicholas Vargas, wrote an article 2019 published in Race, Ethnicity, and Education, I believe, journal. And they do that. They cut the data in all these different ways, and it comes up that the faculty don't look like the students at HSIs. So that's a huge one. That's big. So servingness would be getting, really reaching that parity where our students and our faculty look the same. There aren't as many articles or data about administrators and or staff, particularly classified staff. Although those populations tend to look a little bit more like the population, particularly our staff. So our staff, like our student affairs staff, our classified staff, those populations, with anecdotal data are almost exactly matching the students, right? And if we think about entry-level student affairs professionals, let's say entering immediately, going from undergrad to a master's program and entering like age 24, right? Like they're looking like the students, right? They're like getting in and immediately like we're just those students, right? And are matching the population in many ways. Administration, it depends on the place. Some places are changing dramatically. I'll say like, for example, California Community College System, the dramatic transformation of administration is pretty cool to watch. A lot of presidents of color coming in and bringing in, entire, executive committees of folks of color. But it is slower as well. You still need those folks that are at the administrative level, right, to be able to be at those upper decision making. So we don't see as many presidents, Latina identified presidents for sure. But that's the hope, right? That eventually our administrations will also match the students. Getting there slowly, but the faculty is the big one. So faculty are compositional diversity is a huge part of servingness, and students notice that. The curriculum, I talk about curriculum all the time, been talking about curriculum since my dissertation. What are we teaching students? Because if we continue to teach the same thing over and over again, the same whatever narrative we've learned all our lives, it is not likely going to be centering their ways of knowing. It's not going to be increasing their critical consciousness, right? It's not those sort of things, besides the sort of usual places where we would see that, like ethnic studies or gender and women's studies, right? Like those sort of places, we're going to see it. We've seen it since, since the civil rights movement. So those places are often tapped out, right? Those areas are like, we've been doing this forever, but forever, everybody needs to do it, right? I always say, where's math? Where's the math teachers? Where's the chemistry instructors? Where's your engineering folks? Where's the nursing faculty, right? Like your social work faculty, right? And I say things like social work and nursing because I'm like, these are areas that you're training students who want to be servers. Those are service sort of based disciplines, and they want to immediately go out and serve their communities. Are we training them to serve their communities? Are we teaching them bilingual medical, language, right? Can they speak medical Spanish? Can they serve their communities that they actually want to go back out and serve to? That's servingness, right? Like we actually need to transform that curriculum. It can't stop at the university level, right? Because students are only with us for a couple years before they go back out. And like I said, general patterns show that Latina students stay close to home. to go to college, they're going to stay close to home to work too, right? Like a good majority. So we're going back, and like you said, the HSIs tend to be sort of grounded in the communities that students are from. So how are we engaging with the communities that we're from? That's servingness, right? I talk about that all the time. It's like, are we thinking about that we actually are serving this community just by graduating students from this campus? So curricula, composition of faculty, staff, administrators, curriculum, our co-curricular services, right? Any student support services. I tend to see also spaces, I call them like pockets of servingness or spaces of servingness. So your cultural centers, right? Your like spaces like that, identity-based spaces that, again, have always been doing this work, but then other areas that haven't sort of caught up, like financial aid or admissions and records, right? Places where students are like, I'm still not seeing, right, the same sort of level of diversity, right, in those areas. So there's a lot of work there, a lot of conversations around like outreach and financial aid, folks that are Spanish speakers. Bilingualism is a huge conversation in HSI. I call it linguistic servingness. There's an episode of Que Pasa HSI.
Yeah.
I wrote a blog about it because it's huge, right? Linguistic servingness. And the linguistic servingness really is serving students' families and serving their communities, because our students generally are going to be English speakers. In order to get into a U.S. institution, you have to be able to complete an English curriculum, right? But doesn't mean that their families or the people surrounding them are bilingual. But then the other thing is we don't allow them to be bilingual, right? We don't allow students to be bilingual. What if we did, right? What if we allowed students to be bilingual on our campuses? That would be servingness. That would be linguistic servingness, right? And it matters. It's that validation theory, Laura Rendon, right? Kind of like that matters, right? Like I can speak Spanish and not feel like I'm going to be, targeted or whatever it may be, right? Which people are targeted for speaking Spanish in this country, to be able to openly do that, right? On an HSI campus. So a lot of campuses are really thinking a lot about language. Of course, we have to be careful because Hispanic doesn't mean, or Latinx doesn't mean you necessarily speak Spanish. There's a continuum, obviously. So that's the complexities, right, of this work. So yeah, what other things? Those are like, I guess, like I said, the sort of tangible things, right? Those are the things that are most like germane to us, right? That we know the most. You dig deep into the servingness framework and we start getting into like policies, right? Like, what kind of policies are preventing students from succeeding? There's a ton of policies that keep students from succeeding, like putting holds on their records for financial reasons, right? Okay, yes, there's reasons why we have to do that, but also if that's the reason our students are not enrolling the next semester, we have a persistence issue, right? And it's based on our policy, right? That okay, we need to rethink, like, is that policy serving our students? How can we rethink that policy in order to better serve our Latina students, right? Maybe a policy that prevents students from bringing a child to campus could prevent them from coming to class that day, right? If they are a parent, right? Let's say that they're a parent, and they're like, I don't have childcare, I can't come to class. Versus a campus is like, bring them, it's fine, we'll figure it out, right? And I get it, there's legal implications to that, but campuses are grappling with all of that, right? If like, what are the reasons why our students aren't coming or aren't persisting or missing a lot of class or whatever it may be. And with your Latina population, it's so layered of all the reasons why there are barriers, right? It's barriers to finishing. So that's the deep level, like policy type of stuff. The hiring practices, I talk a lot, because if we have a diversity issue, we have a hiring issue, right? The fact that we can't diversify fast enough, partially it's in our hiring practices. We have to dig deep into those. How racist are those? Right? How do we evaluate who we're bringing in? How do we evaluate faculty coming in, right? How do we evaluate administrators? Is it based on those, what I call the white normative ways of knowing, or is it based on like this person actually is committed to serving this population? And I talk about that all the time in HSI, is like the people that need to be here are the ones that are committed to serving low income, which is part of the HSI designation. I did mention low income students of color, right? You have to be committed to serving, teaching, mentoring those students. That's your population. You're not going to get to wish away and wish for some other students. This is the population at HSI. So you got to be 100% committed to that and what that brings. So that's some of the structure sort of things.
Woo! I knew you'd get excited. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Thank you for that. And I love that language. It's so obvious because it's right in the name, but then once you name servingness, there's so much more. And I love you began, I mean, you gave us a lot of tangible things that we could do, but also you began with the embodiment in being and that servingness mindedness and embodiment. This is how we do. It's part of the being of the institution. I think that can be really powerful in creating some cultural shifts and some paradigm shifts.
Yeah,
I want to, you said you've been doing this for a long time, decades, written and edited 3 books. You're writing another. You've got the podcast with over 40 episodes, many more by the time folks are listening. I'd love to hear what is sort of on the cutting edge of your thinking. What are you learning? Where are you being pushed around HSIs and what folks can be doing? What's on your learning edges?
Yeah. Oh, so many. Thank you for asking that. I'm learning all the time. And I just love it, which is why I love the podcast, because I get to learn from folks on the ground, right? Like the people that come onto my podcasts are, I do have some academics, but mostly it's practitioners, right? I get academics in there to, help us theorize. But I want the people that are doing, right? That's the people I invite, are like, you are doing this. Like, what are you doing? Help us figure this out. And so I learn a lot from there, right? I think one of the things I would say as far as what's on my mind right now, because I am deep in like writing this book, right? This next book, working on a couple articles, like I'm just in writing mode, right? In thinking mode. And I was thinking about HSI directors, right? And whether or not we need HSI directors. And that's something I've been thinking about a lot. Campuses that get HSI grants, they have a director of the grant, right? So the Title V is the most common funding stream, but also Title III. So those are the 2 common funding streams through HSI is HSI designated money. So the PI is the grant, sometimes is the director of the grant, sometimes not, right? Sometimes there's a PI and a director of the grant. But either way, that person's job is to implement the grant, right? They say, all right, what's the logic model? What are the outcomes? What are we delivering? I have to report every year back to the federal government how we're spending the money. Did we hire the people we were going to say, we said we were going to hire? It's very technical sort of grant. Anyway, that's implemented a grant knows very technical grant implementation stuff. That's not the same as an HSI campus-based director. And very few campuses, I was just actually listening to a podcast, one of my episodes of Get Bus HSIs, and it's with MSU Denver, Metro State University Denver, and their HSI director said there were 8 in the country that he knew of. So there's not that many. And when we say the HSI director is like that's their job daily to implement HSI and to do servingness. Some of the ones that are most well known, and I even say this in that episode, is like Dr. Marla Franco at University of Arizona, very well known in our HSI community. She's actually a vice, I think, president at this point of HSI. She was a provost at one point. I think she's vice president of HSI initiatives. And she has a whole staff, right? And yeah, they help other people on campus get HSI grants, but that's not their job, right? They're not getting HSI grants and they're not necessarily implementing them necessarily. They might be getting some in their office, but their job is to move the campus, right? And so that's what the HSI directors are doing. They, I was looking for themes, right, in the HSI directors, and one of them is, I think, relationship building. Is that campus HSI directors spend a lot of time building relationships. The folks that I've had on the podcast that are HSI directors, that's what they talk about. They're constantly, like, daily building relationships. They're over here trying to convince this faculty in this area to apply for a grant. They're trying to convince the advancement office to build relationships with funders, right, that can help support or advance the HSI work. Because there is funding beyond the federal funding, obviously, that can be used for HSI, right? They're over here talking to the alumni, alumni folks. How do we get more Latina alumni involved in this, in this work? They're talking to the Latinx Cultural Center, right? Like making sure they're engaged in student serving type of stuff. But student serving stuff isn't the main goal, right? Like that's one area, and there are groups of folks that are doing that, but they're doing all this like deep sort of movement, right, of the campus? How are we going to move the entire campus and get everybody on board so that everybody on campus knows we're at an HSI, which is, I would say that's my freedom dream, is that we would all know we were at an HSI. We're not there, meaning every single student enters, they know they entered an HSI. Every faculty member knows they teach at an HSI. Every administrator knows we are an HSI. You know, at that point, hopefully alumni, families all know we're HSI. Right. And so that's what the HSI director's role is. So that's huge, right? Like having somebody that can sort of drive this work, but to know, like I just said, that's a stat. And I'm pretty sure I know all 8 of those folks that he named. There's not that many. That's a little bit compared to 600 HSIs that have, right, that are HSIs.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a distinction here between the person doing the grant management and reporting, and then the person leading around servingness.
Yes.
Right. Those are separate things. Let's not
totally
make
different things.
the reporting, the leading. Those are separate.
Yeah, the grant implementation even, right, isn't really the servingness. HSI grants are in the servingness framework. So we talk about in the framework as like HSI grants will help you do servingness, but they're not the only. Right, that's not the end of servingness. It's not the beginning and end of servingness. It's a dimension of servingness. And so, yeah, you should absolutely get HSI grants. But like I said, some people just don't. Stephanie Aguilar-Smith is writing a lot of really cool HSI work right now, and she looks at the perpetual winners of HSI grants and the perpetual not winners. That there are some campuses that apply over and over again and don't get it. And she's writing about what's going on, like the underlying, you know, a lot of it is around meritocracy and, you know, like larger systems of why some campuses are really good at it, the sort of networks that they have and the knowledge they have of even grant getting. Not all campuses have that, but you kind of need that grant getting, right, to help you move this stuff. That MSU Denver episode, they launched a grant workshop for their faculty on campus, right, a grant like institute to help their faculty, right, learn to write grants that will help them do this work. That's servingness, right? Like how do we better equip our faculty and staff to do this work? We can't just tell people, even this with like curriculum, right? We can't just tell people like, go implement an anti-racist curriculum. That'll be servingness, right? People are like, I don't know what anti-racism is, right? Like, what are you talking about, right? And what does it look like in math, right? Like I always say, I always bring math in. And so we have to, a lot of the, you know, focus with HSI is professional development, is training people to know how to do this stuff. Like, so we're retooling the entire campus. Retooling the entire campus is going to take decades, right? And we're kind of like, I have to convince campuses that like, this is what this is, right? If you're committing to now decades of work, right? That none of us are going to see actually the fruits of our labor. But we're doing it because we know it's right, right? And it's going to matter to students in the long run. It's going to matter to HSIs in the long run. But yeah, the retooling of campuses. So yeah, the director's role, the relationship building that has to go into doing this work. The kind of folks that do this work tend to be minoritized also. So not only Latina identified, but also a lot of women that are driving this agenda on their campuses. Who we know if you cross those intersection, Latinas are underpaid, right? We hear about that often, right? Like compared to other groups, right? Gender and racial groups. Yet they're the ones driving the agenda, right? For the entire campus, right? And often on top of their job that they're already doing. So a lot of around how do we compensate people for this work? Who owns this work comes up a lot. People get very territorial. So that's interesting because people are like, we're overworked. We can't do HSI on top of our job. But then they get mad when they didn't get invited to the HSI meeting. I'm like, didn't you not want to do the work? Aren't you overworked already? So it's a really interesting dynamics that come into play because it's identity based, right? It's like, the identity politics is huge. Is that should only Latina people be doing this work? And or should we, what does solidarity look like in this work, right? How do we get other groups involved in this work? That comes up a lot is a feeling like only Latina people on campus are asked to do this work and everybody else sort of gets a pass. And that feels like a lot when you're one of the smallest groups, right? Particularly faculty and staff still are not anywhere where we need, right? As far as numbers on a lot of HSI campuses to really have a critical mass, particularly at the faculty level.
Yeah.
So
it makes sense that if the student population is going to so dramatically shift, the institution should also dramatically shift, right? Like we
Mm-hmm.
can't say we have a completely different population than we've had before, and we're just going to keep doing things the way we did for the past 50 years. Like this has got to come to be
Mm-hmm.
responsive. I know higher ed is not always great at change, but how do we do that? And I love that you mentioned, you're reminding me of cathedral thinking. And cathedral thinking is that the people who built cathedrals never saw the end of the cathedral, right? The
Mm-hmm.
bricklayer who started the cathedral, his great grandson would be the bricklayer who would finish the cathedral,
Mm.
right?
Interesting. Yeah.
Generational, right? And so,
Mm-hmm.
what are
Yeah.
the things that we're doing now that will play benefit, that is laying the foundation for something that will happen after we leave the institution, after we retire, after we're long gone,
Mm-hmm.
and putting some of those things in place. This is just a different way of thinking about our work. I think sometimes we get so caught up in the now, immediate results, immediate evidence, but some of these things, these transformations take time,
Mm-hmm.
which doesn't mean we shouldn't do them, but how do we think with a broader scope of time?
Mm-hmm. And know that's it's going to take time. One of the comparisons I give, I don't like to compare historically black colleges and universities to HSIs because they're just
Sure.
so different
Yep.
historically. But I do bring up, I'm like, HBCUs when they started, they weren't the HBCUs we see now,
Yeah.
right? If we
Yeah.
think about 1890, and we could say 1890s as an important moment for HBCUs as far as like the 1890s, right? The separate but equal, right? Black institutions that came into play,
Mhm.
particularly in the South. 1890 is an important moment for HBCUs. That's over 100 years ago, right? Those
Right.
institutions did not look like what they look like now. And so we need a century. We're going to need a century to
Right.
get to that point where, we really have reached a moment where this is an actual thing, right? Where HSI is
Yeah.
actually a thing and everybody knows we're at an HSI and it's a liberating space or whatever it's going to be for us.
Yeah.
But we're going to need time and we
Yeah.
need to be patient.
Well, there's that blend of having the cathedral thinking, the long term, what's the impact you want to have for things beyond your horizon? And there's an urgency of the students who are here right now, who
Mm-hmm.
are struggling. There's these equity gaps. How do we make sure we're serving them? So there's both the both and right, the urgency and also long term. I think is really really great. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
this has been fabulous, Gina, but we are running out of time.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to move us to hearing what's really with you now. So the podcast is called Student Affairs Now. We always like to end with this question about what are you thinking? What are you troubling? What are you pondering now? And also, if you want to share with folks can connect with you, that would be great. But what's with you now?
I mean, I shared a lot of it already because
Yeah.
like I said, I'm in the now right now, really thinking about what's the next stage, right? Of like, where do I take this next HSI work? There's one thing I haven't mentioned that is with me now is how am I going to do this? So I've been writing about HSIs. Well, I wrote about HSIs for 10 years from, I always say, one of the widest institutions in the country, because it is, the University
Hmm.
of Pittsburgh. It was never going to be an HSI. I'm probably never going to be an HSI. Anyone listen to me, please fight me. They're so far from being an HSI. And I wrote about HSIs from this space, right? Which is also,
Yeah.
I had to like contend with that, right? Of like, why was I so, I mean, I'm committed to HSI because I'm a product of an HSI. I'm an alum of an HSI, graduate of an HSI, did HSI work as a Title V implementer. So I knew what my driving reason was, but I was also doing it from, that sort of space of like, that it was never going to be anything else, right? But besides that, but I'm now at a place, well, and to say that I was writing and offering recommendations and doing public lecturing about something that I wasn't doing on my own campus. Not to say
Mm.
that I wasn't doing Latino things on my campus, because I was. I actually
Yeah.
implemented a lot of Latine things at Pitt and was sort of driving some of that agenda and brought a lot of things, including our Hispanic Heritage Month, to Pitt.
I
But
said fierce advocate at the beginning. I think we've established it. Yeah.
yes, I was definitely doing that. But we were never going to be an HSI. So I wasn't thinking HSI way. I was just thinking, we just need a little more visibility. Like we're 3% here, we're a little bit here. And so I'm at a campus now, UC Berkeley, that's is an emerging. We're in the emerging state. We're at about 20%. We got 5% to go. and I'm so critical of elitism in the higher ed. And it's so funny. I end up at one of the most elite public institutions in the country that's trying to be an HSI, right? And I'm like, there's reasons we're not an HSI, folks. We're in California.
Yeah.
We could absolutely be one, but we have to contend with all of our selectivity and our elitism and all that sort of historical reasons why we are UC Berkeley, right? So how do we maintain UC Berkeley while becoming an HSI? And now I'm in that. I get to be a part of that. I will be leading some of our efforts in the fall 2024. Helping to start to drive some of this, right? So the things I talk about learning, like the relationship building thing, like I'm taking that in. I'm like, okay, who do I need to build relationships with on campus, right? Who do I need to know? How am I going to help to get this going, particularly from a faculty perspective? Which is going to be my role, right? It's like, how do we develop an HSI like research agenda, right, from the faculty side of the house? Because we need that, right? We need faculty thinking about HSI distinctly around like faculty, right, around faculty life. So that's top of my mind, is learning from all this stuff that I've been sharing how to do HSI and serving for so long, and now I get to do it finally. I didn't get to do it for so long. Besides campuses I worked with, I obviously do a lot of consulting with campuses and help them to drive it. But now it matters because it's my campus, right? And we're gonna see this come. We will see we will hit 25%. I'm for sure. I'm gonna see that. Will I see the moment where we are fully HSI, fully embracing serving? Probably not, right? Like I said, this is going to take time and embrace that. But so that's pretty cool, is that I get to finally do the work that I talk so much about.
That's awesome. All right, Dr. Garcia, where can people find you? Drop it all, website, podcast. Where do you want people to connect with if they have loved this conversation, want more, want to hear more from you? Where can they do that?
Yeah, for sure. So I make it easy. All my connections, social media and website are all my full name. So Gina, Gina, middle name, and ANN Garcia, GARCIA.com. So my website is GinaAnnGarcia.com. My Twitter, or I guess X handle, my LinkedIn. We go to Twitter. I know. I always still say retweet, and I'm like, am I going to say re-X? That doesn't make any sense. No. But yeah, my Twitter handle, my Instagram, my LinkedIn are all Gina Ann Garcia. So as long as you have that middle name in there, you can usually find me. But yeah, no, for sure, check out the podcast. I think the podcast for folks that really want to dig into this conversation, that is the most up-to-date current knowledge around HSI, like it's happening on the ground. I can't write fast enough about what's happening on the ground in HSI. So the podcast, as you know, brings very current, style. I mean, today I talked to y'all about a book I'm writing that we're not going to get to read for like 2 more years, right? But I gave you some of the snippets, right? Of like, so you just can't bring it to life quicker than like, let's say these sort of spaces. So yeah, definitely check out the podcast. It's called Que Pasa HSIs, all streaming sites. You can also find the links on my website.
Yeah. And in the show notes for this episode, we're going to get links to a whole bunch of that stuff. We'll get that added in. And the website the website, Gina Ann Garcia, is a great place to find the podcast, your scholarship, your research, the things and contact information, all of that. So if you want to do the one-stop shop, that's the place to go, and you can connect.
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you, Gina. This has been terrific. I really love seeing your leadership and your scholarship and everything emerge that you're doing. It's been fantastic. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Keith, for having me. Appreciate it.
And thanks to our sponsors of today's episode, Rutledge and Huron. Rutledge, Taylor & Francis is the world's leading academic publisher in education, publishing a wide range of books, journals, and other resources for practitioners, faculty, administrators, and researchers. They welcome Stylus Publishing to their publishing program and are thrilled to enrich their offerings in higher education teaching, student affairs, professional development, assessment, and more. Rutledge is proud to sponsor the podcast Student Affairs Now and view their complete catalog of education titles at rutledge.com/education. And Huron is a global professional services firm that collaborates with clients to put possible into practice by creating sound strategies, optimizing operations, accelerating digital transformation, and empowering businesses and their people to own their future. By embracing diverse perspectives, encouraging new ideas, and challenging the status quo, Huron creates sustainable results for the organizations they serve. And as a huge shout out, as always, to our producer, Nat Ambrosi, who does all the work behind the scenes to make Gina and I look and sound good. We love the support for these important conversations from you, our community. You can help us reach even more folks by subscribing to the podcast on YouTube or our weekly newsletter, where we share our new episodes each Wednesday morning. If you're so inclined, you can also leave us a 5-star review. I'm Keith Edwards. Thanks again to our fabulous guests today, Dr. Gina and Garcia, and to everyone who's watching and listening. Make it a great week. Thank you, Gina.